Okay. Let's ask our Father to give us His protection and all that we need to make these Zoom rooms happen and all the technology. And that's our prayer to you, Father, that you would just let us sense your presence today. I pray, just thank you, first of all, for each of my brothers, my sisters here, Lord, that you've brought into the room. And thank you for the work that you're doing in each life, in each family, in each location, community. Just pray that you'll continue to direct and protect and provide, do all that we need, Father, to do the work that you've planted each one of us into. I pray, too, Lord, that you would just kind of watch over the technology today and let everything work well. Let everyone be able to access this technology well today. And I just put all these matters into your hands, Lord. You said we can cast all of our cares upon you because you care for us. And that's just so good to know, Father. And it's in your Son and our Savior Jesus we pray. Amen. All right. We've got kind of a full plate today to get through. I think this week you are working on your outcomes chapter, which is chapter 6. Let me just make a couple of brief comments on that. Mainly, for that chapter, I'm looking for some very specific outcomes that you're hoping to accomplish through your project. Okay? Try not to be real general, try to be very specific. And the other, the other item I like in each one of those sections is to tell me, and you may not have this all together yet, but tell me what criteria you would use to indicate if that particular desired outcome has been successful. Okay? If I was, I've used the gang violence example quite often in some of my instructional work, say gang violence in Seattle. I might say one of my outcomes is to have at least 10 churches become involved in establishing programs for working within the gang community. It's very specific. Okay? I'm looking for 10 churches who will have started programs or at least will have a planning committee in place that I will have helped possibly facilitate through the project. Okay, so just be very specific in terms of outcomes. Somebody has their microphone on. Need to have you mute it. Okay. If any of you ever done grant writing, a grant foundation will ask you for objectives, but not only will they ask you for objectives, but they will ask you for, again, the criteria that you will use to determine if you've actually met those objectives. And, of course, grant foundations are very, very picky about that issue because they're giving money. So I just want you to be familiar with that process. When you write objectives, come up with criteria by which you're going to evaluate whether those objectives have been met, satisfied through the project. Like I say, those criteria may become more clear to you as you get into the project. Okay, but right now, at least try to speculate what kinds of objectives that you hope to accomplish and what criteria you'll use to evaluate how successful you've been in meeting those objectives. Okay? So that's this week. As you get into your work next week, you'll be getting into the final weeks of this course, weeks 8 and 9. And during those 2 weeks, you'll be working on chapter 5 of your proposal, the research methodology and project design section. And that, of course, is very central to the project. We want to make sure that you are developing a methodology that is appropriate to what you're trying to accomplish, within your particular project, and that you will know what kinds of tools you'll want to utilize in order to answer the research questions that you've established. There again, I had you speculate, come up with some research questions in that first chapter, and we've put that in the purpose statement section. So, specific research questions, what it is you're trying to know, learn, understand in order to have a successful project. Because for our purposes at BGU, we need to understand what kind of data we need in order to design an effective intervention strategy. Okay, and so we don't just collect data theoretically. We look for the kind of data that we need in order to design an intervention strategy that's actually going to accomplish some specific goals in a particular area. All right, let's go ahead and get into the PowerPoint. Let me share my screen here. Okay, are you seeing PowerPoint yet?
Yes.
Yes.
You can see it.
Okay, good. Okay. Just trying to find one other item here that I want to have showing. Okay. Okay, I think I'm there. All right, and if you have questions along the way, jump in, because I just want to get through a lot of material today, and I want to try to apply some of these concepts also to your particular projects. We probably can't get into them all today just because we have a limited amount of time. But the research chapter, chapter 5, the methodology chapter, is where you're going to define the approach you're going to use to get at data, to design the intervention, and to evaluate what you've done. Okay, we've mentioned at the beginning of this course that a BGU final project is to facilitate some kind of transformation, and of course that's a major concept for us. We have the 8 transformational leadership perspectives. We emphasize transformation quite a bit in all of our courses. I think we've mentioned the fact that as researchers, we are going to be participant researchers generally. We are working in communities, in organizations, and we are a part of the people generally with whom we are interacting in terms of research. We talk about action research versus passive research, and action research actually is the fact that we are doing investigation so as to solve a particular problem. Okay, we aren't just trying to understand and obtain knowledge. That's a big part, but the goal of having that knowledge, having that data, is to actively pursue some answers, some solutions to a particular context, a particular problem situation. Okay. As you start that chapter, your proposal chapter, it's always good to start with a summary paragraph, okay? And I just like to see, summarize again the problem that you're working with. You might summarize the research goals, the information needed. That would really just be a summary of the research questions, just what it is you're trying to learn through your data. And then maybe just a sentence that summarizes the intervention strategy. That introduction paragraph is for the reader's benefit, so that reader can see where this chapter is going to be moving along, what some of the components are. So I advise you to go ahead and include those pieces in an introductory paragraph as you start that proposal. First section in the proposal, chapter 5, then will be the data gathering methods. We could say data gathering methods and tools. You'll see the terms methods and tools used in some of the literature. Methods are kind of more the broad picture. We'll talk in a few minutes about a qualitative research method. a quantitative research method. We talk a lot about appreciative inquiry, which is a kind of a method that can be used within other methods, okay? As you have a qualitative approach, you may be using appreciative inquiry, an appreciative inquiry approach, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Some of the tools, though, that you may be using, maybe interviews, surveys, focus groups, case studies, other methods, and we'll talk again about a few of those tools that you will be utilizing possibly within the context of your particular project. And you need to indicate a purpose for each one of those methods or tools, okay? And let's use the term tools. I used to kind of use the terms methods and tools kind of interchangeably. I think it was you, Martine, that kind of gave me a little distinction on those. And so so tools, we're usually talking about these specific tools, interviews, surveys, focus groups. A method would be often, like I say, qualitative, quantitative, etc. But, indicate the purpose of each tool. Let's say it that way. Why are you using a particular interview? Why are you using the particular questions that you're using? Some of your purposes, you're trying to understand the perceptions of the people that are experiencing a problem. Maybe you're trying to understand the perception of community leaders that you're out talking with, interviewing. You're trying to develop more information to get a better understanding of the problem, understanding of the perception of those that are involved, so that you can design an effective intervention strategy in terms of a seminar, a city consultation, whatever it might be. And then we on the academic cabinet, we like to see some samples of the kinds of questions you might be using. I'm just looking for maybe, 2 or 3 questions so that I know that you're beginning to think about what it is you want to ask of people, whether you're asking that in terms, through surveys or interviews or focus groups. Put down a few questions, a few sample questions of what you'll be asking of those that will be participating in your research. We've got the second major section of that chapter 5 is the intervention strategy. And I think as we've talked about, briefly, the idea of an intervention strategy is it's some kind of a practical approach that you're going to design to address the problem that you have defined in the beginning chapter of your particular dissertation. Intervention strategies, you might want to begin to indicate how you will use the collected data for designing the strategy. The fact that I've found, say, if I'm doing the gang violence study, I've found that there are many churches, most churches, I'm going to say, don't have any kind of a program, and have no understanding of what really is going on, say, in the gang community. Okay, I might say that I have some of the data I've gathered from gang members helped me have an understanding of, say, the age group, people that are a part of that community. I maybe have gathered data from other kinds of studies or projects that are going on in various parts of the world in regards to gangs. And I'll say, some of that data is going to be used to help me design my particular program in my community. So, indicate, what the data is going to be used for, intervention strategy. Indicate the steps that you're going to use to design the strategy. Okay, I'm going to develop some planning sessions. I'm going to recruit, 8 people to work with me in a strategy planning session. I'm going to maybe recruit leaders that will be part of that session. I may visit other organizations to help me understand. So, just give me some specific steps that you're going to use to design your intervention strategy. And then, of course, describe what are the components of your particular strategy that you would like to design, okay? You're going to maybe do a teaching curriculum. You're going to do a seminar. You're going to do a city consultation. Maybe you're going to do, we have a course called ABCD, Asset-Based Community Development with Dr. Kit Danley. Maybe you're going to use that kind of an approach within a community. So intervention strategy is the place that you would just at least identify that strategy that you're going to be developing. And then indicate other, specifics, the location where you plan to carry out this strategy. Who are some of the anticipated participants that right now that you foresee would become a part of that intervention strategy? When do you anticipate an event or whatever you're going to be doing will take place? So yeah, those are just some of kind of the introductory remarks. And again, we're at the proposal stage. We're not looking for anything in detail, but we need to just get an idea of what that intervention strategy is going to look like. And then you have a third section of that proposal chapter that's called the evaluation methods. And again, you can substitute words methods or tools. In that section, again, what's your objective? What is it? What do you want to learn in this evaluation? Say you've done a seminar and you want to determine how effective that seminar was. Again, what's your criteria for determining the effectiveness of a seminar? What is it you wanted your participants to learn? What kinds of actual, possibly life changes or community changes or organizational changes are you looking for that will be good criteria? Okay, so the objectives are basically what it is you want to find out, because the evaluation section is to be that place where you're going to determine how effective your project has been. Okay, and again, you can do that through surveys, focus groups, additional interviews. It'll just be, it'll be individual to your particular project. Okay. And then again, what will be the tools that you'll use? Again, you may be using surveys, interviews, focus groups, etc. And again, we're just looking for, a couple of paragraphs here in the evaluation to answer some of these. And again, in the evaluation, you may come up with just 2 or 3 sample questions that you would like to ask of people when your project is completed. And you'll ask those people that say who have participated in some way in your particular project. Any questions on those sections before I keep moving on?
I know when the sampling of a qualitative study takes place, you have to establish the sample. How many people are you gonna interview and all that? Now, is that required also in qualitative analysis? Do we have to say, okay, my goal is to survey X amount of people? If I'm going to be doing focus group, the focus groups are going to be composed by X amount of people, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, let me talk about that in a minute here, Gustavo. I'm going to kind of talk about quantitative research versus qualitative. Okay. And so, and we'll kind of see, the exact sample may not be quite as critical in a qualitative study as in a quantitative study, but we'll talk about that in just a minute.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and jump into those sections. You've read hopefully some of the material in the research design book. That particular book gets pretty technical, I know, and so sometimes it's good just to kind of see these big areas, quantitative, qualitative. I'm just trying to kind of put it in a little more condensed version for you. Creswell, of course, he gets pretty detailed on his, all that material. And it's good to read it, but there's a difference in terms of how you'll be doing the kind of research you do here and for other, possibly say a PhD program. And we've talked a little bit about, the difference between a PhD research approach and say a DTL or a DMin. DMin and DTL are, of course, not any less demanding, but, the goals in terms of the practical results may be a bit different in terms of the research. Because like you say, a major purpose for our research in the DTL DMin is to help us design the strategy that's going to help address the problem. Okay, let's look at a few of these terms. Quantitative research. The books will say, you begin with a hypothesis, a supposition. Okay, say we're going to test, let's say the automotive industry. Automotive industry, say an automobile manufacturer has designed a car door, and they say that that car door will withstand a 35-mile-per-hour crash. Okay, they would then design an experiment, some experiments, to see if that hypothesis is true. They may put dummies into a car and start it up electronically, then crash it into a wall going at 35 miles an hour. And they'll determine, okay, how well did those doors survive that crash? Well, that's a quantitative test. Hopefully that test can be repeated. And quantitative results generally involve repeatable results. Hopefully, when they do that crash test, they can do that same crash test 100 times and they'll get similar results. Then they've proven their hypothesis somewhat. There's always going to be exceptions, of course, but they've proven the hypothesis that this car door will withstand a 35-mile-per-hour crash. Okay, so we're using statistical data quite a bit. Here, the accuracy depends on the large enough representative sample. Say crash tests, they may say, I'm going to have to put this car test through 100 crashes to see if I get similar results. Okay. As you're doing a quantitative study, and say for our purposes, maybe you are trying to determine the beliefs, the opinions, the values on a particular topic, okay? In my gang study, I may have said, I want to understand what's the typical understanding of a person who lives in the Seattle area of the problem of gang violence. Are people aware of this? Does it affect their daily lives? Do they know gang members? Have they had family members that have possibly joined a gang? I could do a quantitative study to understand the opinions of a particular population, okay? And that's going to be my purpose in that particular kind of a study. I'm trying to get a representative sample so that when I say a majority of people who live in Seattle feel this way about gang activity in their community, I have used, a fairly representative sample so that I can say that with some level of accuracy. I've referred you to a website, and I put this in your notes, surveysystems.com. There, you can enter a population number and a confidence level, how accurate you'd like that you need to be, and then it will return a sample size based on that population number and that confidence coefficient, okay? For example, if you're in a small community of 100,000 people and you're going to want to do a survey of that community to determine how they feel about a particular topic, 100,000 and you want a 95% confidence level, okay? That's just an accuracy percentage that is used. You're going to need a sample size of 383 people that you're going to survey, okay? Now, as you go to, say you have a population of 1 million, the sample size, oddly enough, does not go up proportionally, okay? The sample size of, say, 1 million people, I forget what it is now, but it's somewhere like between 500 and 700 people for 1 million compared to, say, 383 for 100,000. The smaller the population, proportionally speaking, the sample size is actually smaller. And, we'd have to get into statistical analysis in order to understand, why that particular fact is true. But you don't really need to understand that. It's just if you're going to use a quantitative study in any form in your particular study, you're going to need to have a representative sample. okay? And I would recommend, utilizing this website in order to come up with a sample size, okay? Okay, let's keep moving here. I did say that quantitative work is generally used in a very limited way within a BGU dissertation. You may want to know, what are the representative opinions in a particular population, and if that's something you really need to know for your particular project, then by all means, design some kind of a quantitative survey. Okay. I have one student I'm working with right now over in Malawi. He's a pastor and he's working with one of the church denominations there, and he's been working with the financial status of pastors in the Assembly of God Church. Okay, now he was able to do a quantitative study because there was something like 2,500 pastors that were in the particular population district that he was working with. And he put out a survey to about 1,500 pastors in order to understand how they perceived their own financial situation in relationship to the congregation that they were serving. Now he could do, in a population, in 2,500 pastors, he was able to do a 1,500 survey distribution. I think he got maybe 800 or 900 of those back, which actually in terms of return rates on surveys was okay. So he could justifiably say he included a quantitative component in his study. Generally, I've not seen that to be the case, that most people, they will call their work quantitative because they put out a survey to 25 people and they're collecting how people feel about a particular topic. Unfortunately, that's not really a quantitative study because you've not used a representative sample, say of a particular community. If you're saying, I'm in a community of a few million and I've got 25 people that I'm working with, to say what the information you're gathering from those people is representative of the 3 million member community is definitely inaccurate. So let's jump to the next slide and talk a little bit about qualitative research. Qualitative research, and again, this is what most students would be using, I think, in their BGU dissertations, final projects. Here, you don't really begin with a hypothesis, okay? We're not going to say, the door of this car, my hypothesis is it's going to survive a 35-mile-an-hour crash. You don't start with any kind of a hypothesis. You may have some assumptions in your mind, about a particular community. The very fact that you're working on a particular issue. Dion's working on a curriculum for a water treatment plant there in Guyana because he's seen that, based on his observations so far, there's not been good courses for the engineers in water treatment. Somebody else maybe is working on, Galina, you're working on training in relationships there in some Russian areas. You have a sense of what's going on there. That's why you're doing the project. If you're going to really do a quantitative study, say in a particular community of Russia, and you're going to say, X number of people feel this way about relationships, you would have to do a fairly large survey in order to have that kind of data. So I would recommend you probably wouldn't do that, okay? Qualitative research, you'll read the literature, it says it uses words more than numbers, okay? We're not necessarily saying X number of people believe or think a certain way, okay? You can use smaller samples and open-ended questions. What we're trying to do in a qualitative study is we're just trying to understand how a few people perceive a situation. And possibly then some of those people are going to be involved with you in putting together an intervention strategy. Again, your sample size won't necessarily and probably won't represent the whole population, okay? Unless, like I say, the one student I'm working with was able to say, you know, we had 2,500 pastors, I did a survey, 1,500, and so he could say, you know, justifiably, yes, the quantitative part of my study was indeed accurate based on the coefficients of accuracy in the populations that the statistical analysis gives me, say, from this website that I gave you a moment ago. But generally speaking, you're going to be working in a situation where possibly you're going to maybe work with 20, 25 people, maybe more, and you want to have them, you want to do some more in-depth thinking, conversation with them, interviews with them, okay? And that's justifiable for a qualitative research, okay? You don't have to have a representative sample. You're just, because your purpose is not to say this sample or my survey is representative of how this whole community feels. What I'm doing is I'm interviewing a group of people to get a little more in-depth understanding of how they perceive a particular situation, okay? Say with my gang violence, I may have interviewed leaders in 10 or 15 different organizations, and I'm saying, based on my interviews with these people, these are some of the issues that people are seeing in our community of Seattle, for example. Some books say, if you say you're doing interviewing, that you will keep doing interviews until you start getting repetitive information, okay? Say I'm trying to find out, you know, about gang violence, and I'm interviewing community leaders, and you know, I've interviewed 15 leaders, and they say, yeah, I've had gang violence has affected me, and it has affected some of the issues that we've decided to work on in our community. Once I have that information, I can say, okay, based on these 15 leaders that I've talked to, this is a common observation that they've had. I wouldn't have to do any more, okay? If I kept getting different answers to a particular situation, then I may decide I need to do a few more interviews to see if I'm really kind of getting a good picture of what's going on with a particular situation. Let me go on to a couple other things. A few specific subcategories of qualitative research. One is called grounded theory. You've maybe heard that term. Again, grounded theory simply means that we'll call it the hypothesis or the assumptions that I'm coming up with, they grow out of the interviewing, out of the conversations that I'm having with people. Again, like I said, I'm not starting with an assumption or hypothesis. I may have some in my mind, but I'm not really trying to prove that in a particular way. I want to just start talking with people to understand, you know, what's going on in their lives. Say in my example with gang members, if I was able to say go out and interview 10 or 15 gang members, if they would talk with me, maybe say one of my questions is, you know, why did you decide to join a gang? And I may get, you know, various answers. You know, some may say, well, you know, I needed protection. Somebody else may say, I just wanted to have a feeling of belonging. Somebody else said, you know, I was homeless, and these folks provided, I was able to live with another gang member, and it helped me. As I talk with those, say those 10 or 15 gang members, I may start getting some common themes that will come forth. You know, I was homeless. I wanted to feel like I wanted to belong. I felt I needed protection. As I see those same kinds of themes coming forth in my interviews, and they start repeating themselves, I have a pretty good feeling that I'm pretty accurate in terms of what I'm hearing here. and I may only need to have 10 or 15 interviews, because then I'm seeing some of the same kinds of reasons coming forth from those gang members. So again, I'm saying here, themes emerge from the conversations, okay? Like I said, the example I'm giving, I was homeless. I wanted to belong. I needed protection. When you're taking notes, if you're taking notes, you may, and I don't recommend that's the best way to do interviews. It's better if you can actually get the permission, and you need written permission to actually do a tape recording of your interview. But then when you listen to that recording, you may start a column of say, I heard the word belonging, I write that down. I heard the word protection, I write that down. Then as I keep hearing that theme, I may put, check marks. I may end up with, 8 check marks by belonging. I may end up with 10 check marks by protection. Then as I look at that, I can say, okay, those seem to be some common themes among gang members as I've done my interviewing here, to help me understand these are some of the issues that I maybe need to address with churches, with some kind of intervention strategy that I pull together, because this is how the gang members are feeling. I have another set of data as here's how some of the community leaders that I've talked with are feeling about this issue. And all that data, hopefully, will give me some information, some ideas on how to design an intervention strategy, a training seminar, or whatever it happens to be, a city consultation that will help me begin to address this issue, okay? So there again, we're looking for people's perceptions, and perceptions are not always the reality. But, for our purposes, the perception is the all-important issue, because as people are perceiving something, that makes it a problem, okay? The protection may not really be an issue for the people that I'm interviewing, but they feel it's an issue, so therefore it's an issue for them, okay? So grounded theory simply means, as I'm, say, doing interviews, certain themes will begin to emerge, and based on those themes, I can start to make some generalizations in terms of what's going on here. In my situation, why people become parts of gangs. And then I can start to have an assumption, a theory that kind of comes forth. So that's what they mean, the idea that in qualitative research, the theories, the assumptions grow out of the interviews. You don't start with an assumption or hypothesis you're trying to prove. It grows out of your conversations with people. A couple other items here, other types of qualitative approaches. We call something a narrative. A narrative simply, instead of having directed questions to people, say in an interview, you may just say, John, tell me a little bit about how you've experienced life here in the Seattle area over about the last 5 years. And then I just kind of let that person begin to tell me their story. I may, interject some clarification points along the way. If any of you done, counseling, you become good listeners. And sometimes you may just interject, a thought or a question. And, so, I hear you saying, John, that you've actually had a family member become a part of a gang. Is that right? Right. Okay. And how, has that affected your family? Has that affected you somehow? And so the person then just kind of tells his or her story. Okay. That's what a narrative is. Sometimes you can do research that way, and you may then put together what is called a composite narrative. Based on talking with, say, 10 or 15 different people, you hear their story, you may put together a composite story and say, this composite story represents what a typical gang member feels like here in the Seattle area. Okay, so that's one qualitative approach. I haven't seen it used a whole lot. I've seen it used sometimes. So there are people that have had, they've given their a story, let people tell their story, and then they will, based on those stories, they'll come up with a composite story for their research, and so the reader kind of understands this is what a typical gang member might feel like in the Seattle area. So that's a narrative. A case study, you'll hear that word. is more of an in-depth exploration of a particular situation over a period of time. And a lot of these are just terms. They kind of blend together sometimes. Sometimes it's difficult to sort them out, but we do use them, just to give us some idea of what's happening here. But anyway, in-depth exploration over a period of time. Say you're going to look at an organization, and you're going to look at the life of this organization from over the last 1 year period, or say 5 year period. Maybe you're going to, in 5 years, you're not going to get actual empirical data. Empirical data means observing it at this moment in time. You may look at an organization and say, the history of this organization, here's some of the highlights. And you'll list some of those highlights. But then you may be doing some observation of an organization, say over a 3-month period of time. And you may observe the operations of that organization. You may observe how decisions are made in that organization. You may observe what is kind of the emotional climate of the staff in that organization. You may observe how that organization seems to interact with its community. So all those, a case study, you're kind of part of that setting, and yet you are, it's a case, okay? You're looking at a particular situation over a particular slice of time. That's really what kind of makes it a case study, okay? There again, it's not appropriate for the whole final project. It's just one way of gathering data. After I've, say, done a case study on an organization, I may then put together some kind of a consultative seminar for that organization that we will go over some ideas I think might be helpful in terms of the decision-making process of that organization. Say I'm trying to introduce more of a joy at work kind of mentality. I may give a seminar on joy at work for the leadership of that organization. But a case study, again, would be kind of doing in-depth study of a particular group at a particular time. Okay, you kind of have a snapshot of that group at a particular time. The other issue, it's kind of a case study, but it's called an ethnography. Again, it's really a case study of a whole ethnic culture. If, say, Gustavo, you're doing something there in a community in Venezuela, you may want to say you were looking at the culture to understand the culture, the values of the people, why they behave in a certain way, how they function within their natural setting, okay? Again, you'll use interviews, you may use focus groups, you just observe your own experiences, but you're looking, your purpose is to understand what are the values, the norms of this particular culture within a setting, which then maybe gives you some understanding of why people are functioning in the way they're functioning, okay? Why, say, violence is breaking out. Is there anything in the culture that could possibly give a clue to some of the underlying roots of that kind of violence, for example? So again, that's ethnography is just, it's a type of case study. And again, like I said, grounded theory, narrative, case study, ethnography, some of these terms just blend, but it's kind of just giving you different perspectives of a qualitative approach. The idea is we're just trying to understand how people perceive their situations, possibly why they act, behave the way they do, why they think the way they do, and then all that hopefully is going to help us design an intervention strategy that is going to make some difference in the lives of these people. Let me stop there before I go into the last section. Comments, thoughts? Did you have your microphone on, Gustavo?
Yes, because I was thinking.
Oh,
because there is a section where we talk about the history. Like on the introduction part, we talk about the history of the city that we're studying, and I don't know if I can use some of that information to establish a connection on the cultural values of the city.
Yeah, I mean, you would, yeah, you'd have to determine when you're looking at the cultural values of a particular city, you know, in research writing, you say make a claim, okay? Um, you know, drug addiction has been common in this city for the last 20 years.
Correct.
You know, that's a statement that you make. Your reader says, well, now why should I believe that? What are you basing that statement on? Okay.
Correct.
You can say, okay, here's the statistics that I can get from certain census data, if they've used census data in that particular city. Here's information I've collected by talking with different community leaders. Here's information I've gathered. So all that is, you know, most of that probably would be documented information, that it's written down, statistics you collect, although you may do some interviewing to kind of help confirm what some of the written statistics say. If you were going to actually call it ethnography, a big part of your study would be focusing on those values and that culture. That may not be what you're going to really, that may not be the main focus of your study. You know, your main focus is trying to design some training programs that will help train leaders in transformational principles. But, you know.
Yeah, but you want to establish that connection between the tools that you're going to be using and why are you using those tools?
Exactly.
Well, because the cultural values of these societies are X, Y, and Z, and that this is why I want to use those tools.
Exactly, yeah. When I worked at the University of Montana, somebody has a microphone on, and I'm not sure where that's coming from.
I'm sorry, Dr. Payne, that's me. I thought I was muted. This is Cheryl. I was waiting because I had a question, but I'll mute until you're finished.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and mute. Then you can jump in again. When I was working at the University of Montana, one of my roles there, I was working with, they called them Social Security counselors, coordinators in the United States. And these particular Social Security coordinators, counselors, were working specifically with people with disabilities within Native American cultures, okay? My job was to collect information on talk with experts on particular Native American cultures to provide background for some of these counselors in terms of the kinds of values that Native American families would be involved in, because it really affected how these Social Security coordinators worked with particular people that were applying for disability benefits. You know, one aspect of the Native American culture, and I had experts who would come in on our Zoom room online conference calls, who would then, you know, try to educate some of the counselors on some of the values. You know, one value, for example, is, you know, a person in some particular Native American cultures didn't make a decision without hearing from a pretty big group of family members. So that, you know, some of the counselors couldn't understand why one person who was applying for disability benefits would bring 10 members of his or her family with him to the counseling session. Well, part of the Native American value system was you don't make decisions without having a pretty good group of family members there. So once the counselors understood that value, they could then, you know, more effectively work with, you know, the particular population that they were addressing. So yeah, that's just one example of how, you know, a cultural value is going to possibly affect how we're working with a particular issue or problem.
And I've been discussing this subject in depth with a couple of pastors, because certain cultural values can be subjective to the historical moment of the country. And then what I'm trying to establish is that connection between the subjectivity of those cultural values and the objectivity that God principles have for that community. How can we bring the objective values of the Bible the principles of God, the gospel, to these subjective values of the community. And how can we develop transformational leaders by developing strategies that bring these subjective values of the gospel to the subjective values of the culture.
Yeah, very good. You know, as you know, one of our transformational perspectives is contextual, okay? And the idea there is that when we're trying to bring content, information into a setting, we want it to fit the context. There's a book that, I don't know if we still use it in the overture classes or not. It was called Orthodox Alaska, I think was the name of it. You'd have to look up the author. But, you know, he did a study on how Russian Orthodox missionaries went into Alaska some of the first times, and how they were able to take the gospel and adapt it to certain cultural values of the time. The whale hunt, for example, was a big issue in Alaska at that time. And you know, one concept in the whale hunt for some of the native Alaskans was that the whale actually allowed himself to be caught, and he would give his life for the community.
Correct.
Well, wow. I mean, you know, we've got, of course, a contextual allusion to talk about the gospel in the context of some values of a particular culture. You know, example of, you know, how we are taking information and we're contextualizing it. You know, and the whole, a lot of things in the whole missionary endeavors. The Peace Child, some of you might be, you know, familiar with that work within some of the African communities. How the Peace Child was an allusion that was used by missionaries.
Is it by Michael Oleska?
Yep.
Olexa?
Yeah, Alaska. He's the one who did the Orthodox Alaska. Exactly.
Okay, I got it here. I put it on my card.
Okay. All right. Cheryl, you had a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I think it piggybacks off of Gustavo's question. And the question is, I think my proposal is going to require a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. And then I have a question about resources. My proposal, I have a theory that if attorneys are paid their regular hourly fee, maybe not, maybe not as high as 500 or 600 an hour like we do in Dallas, but maybe 200 an hour, they would be more likely to do the hard work necessary in representing the mentally ill who need them, incarcerated or just or already indicted. And this is based upon recognition that judges are paying $50 per plea bargain. So they just kind of go through cases, and volume is what's determining how justice is done. And when you look at those cases, my theory is there are some people going to jail who don't need to be there. They need to be in treatment. Mm-hmm. Or maybe the mentally ill defendant needs to be in jail, but the court or the trier of fact, the jury, needs to have the information about the mental illness. It could perhaps mitigate, or maybe none of the above, but I just see attorneys going through the motions in court. So when I talked to a judge, he agreed with me. So we're an arrogant group, attorneys, and I think we would be best served if I did the actual number crunching of getting the files of people who have well, maybe just go through a set of files, find those who possibly have mental illness, go root them out. This is all very hard because I'm running up against attorney-client privilege. I have to track down the defendant. I have to track down the attorney. And that's why I think it's a combination, but I can't see a better method of getting the attention of the bar. And that's really my audience. The paper asks, who is your audience? So my audience is really the bar for the most part. I'm trying to help the bar, but I'm also trying to help defendants as we see, whenever a case makes it to TV, that person typically has some sort of mental disturbance. So this is very useful. It'd be useful. I think it's going to be really hard to do. So I'm trying to figure out, Then my other question for you, and I'll mute back up, is I can't find anything on this topic in the form of a book. I'm finding a lot of articles in bar journals that I'm looking at, law review articles that I'm looking at from different law schools, and various bar journals from Washington State to Indiana. But there are no books, and nobody has a solution. I'm the only one. I keep looking for solutions to compare my idea with, and I'm the one with the idea. And I'm wondering, is it a really stupid idea? Is that why there's no work out there on it? Is it just too difficult? Should I quit and just do something else?
Well, let me see if I can summarize, if I understand again. If with the problem you would see is we have people going to jail that isn't necessarily the right direction they should be pointing. The courts should be pointing them. They should possibly be headed to some kind of treatment program. Would that be a possible? That's a possible. But that would be the problem at this point, right? You're trying to.
That's right. I put the person that I put in my paper is, I think, pretty typical according to the judges. He had a condition that that caused him to continually violate his probation. So he was going to jail for 6 years. He definitely violated his probation with his behavior. Because I brought in the psychiatrist under the circumstances I set forth in my paper, he went home in about 6 weeks. He was put on suicide watch, and that was my cue that something might be amiss. And I just thought, well, let's have him examined. And the judge wasn't interested, the prosecutor wasn't interested. And after it was all said and done, this man went home in 6 weeks rather than 6 years. Now, he was still angry with me because he thought he was going to go home that day. He had to go back to jail for a while. But there was still a positive outcome compared to what it could have been. And it just got me wondering, he was not the first person that I had run across with this scenario. Mental illness, jail. Mental illness, jail. It's pretty common. Mm-hmm. And we as a bar are not addressing this. They're just going, these attorneys, especially the court-appointed attorneys that I work with, are just going through these cases as volume cases, which will build up their bottom line, because they do. You can, visit your client in the courtroom. They don't even go to the jail. They visit the client in the courtroom, and then they talk them into a plea, and now this person is in jail for 3, years, 10 years, whatever. And I just think part of it is motivated by economics. So if we pay the attorneys the money that they want to make, then they would take the time to do the work. I don't think that they're going to take advantage of the situation, or I think that this nonprofit that I'm proposing would monitor the case if they came back for more, which is why I think you have to have an attorney on the nonprofit. But it's just I'm trying to come up with a way to encourage attorneys basically to do their job, to ensure that due process is given. And our Constitution allows for consideration of the mental health status of the defendant.
Right. So you're going to have to, you have to determine, obviously, for the study, you'd have to choose a very narrow geographical location that you're going to do this. You couldn't realize and say, I'm going to be able to reform the whole United States on this particular issue, right? It's just too broad.
And I've done that, and the judge that I spoke to in Waxahachie, Texas, is a perfect location, and I've done the work down there, and he's already agreed to let me do it.
Okay, that's what
I
you
just
could
don't
do.
know
then.
what I'm doing.
You're going to say, yeah, my focus is this particular area of Texas. And then, you could say from this study, it might be able to be generalized. Other people in other communities could then take on your work and possibly, make a difference in other communities. But you're going to focus your study in that particular area of Texas. And then you're going to have to say, okay, I'm going to brainstorm a moment. You'd need to be looking at, you'd have to look at cases, right? You'd have to be looking at records and determine, okay, what percentage of cases that were tried in this time period was mental illness involved, and how many of those cases resulted in jail time? Okay, that's one kind of statistical piece of information you could use to justify to say a large percentage of people are being sent to prison based on mental illness. And you would do that with some statistical investigation you're doing through court cases that you study and make some generalizations from, right?
That's really good, and that's what I came up with listening to Gustavo. So hello again, Gustavo. Okay.
You would be doing I don't know if you could do, well, see, that would be quantitative.
Yeah.
You have to have enough court record, enough cases that you examined in proportion to the number of cases that involve mental illness. And so, you'd have to find some kind of a correlation. And so you may want to, if you want to actually do the quantitative side of it. Qualitatively, if you have, X numbers of judges that you can talk with, and there's X numbers of lawyers you're able to talk with, and you're able to bring those groups together in some kind of setting where they would actually talk together in a focus group on this issue, that could be another form of qualitative research tools that you could use.
Okay.
Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And my other problem, are y'all going to send me packing because I can't find any books on this subject?
It doesn't really matter. I mean, some topics you're going to mainly hit the journals, and you're going to do case law. Okay, those are all valid sources. You may not have any books. You may find some books, but most of your resources are probably going to be journals and case law.
And the best source I found thus far is newspaper article.
And newspaper, that's fine too.
Okay, good. I'm done. Thank you.
Good. Michael, let me just look at you'd ask, your project is mainly to establish a training center for emerging leaders, leaders owned and run by denominational churches. However, the candidate are from evangelical churches. The end product is transform the culture of a dichotomy of evangelicals at large. Okay, which melody do you? Okay, so you're if I remember correctly, you're working with an organization called Live Life, and in Ethiopia, you're kind of pulling together a training center that would really work with people, not only training them, academically, but spiritually, emotionally, a lot of different areas, if I remember correctly.
That's true.
Okay. Tell me, Live Life is an organization that's already in existence, right?
No, it's the organization that I'm planning to establish.
Live Life, yeah, okay, all right. Probably then what you would want to do is look at the problem that you've established, and in terms of the issue, you'd have to determine what do you need to know in order to justifiably start that center? How would you actually understand that there really is a need for the kind of organization that you would like to start?
Okay, this is my biggest issue. As you might know, the Ethiopian evangelical culture at large is a victim of the dichotomy. Whenever people think of community development, they think of a non-profit organization in foreign funds. So churches are not actively involving in community services so as to bring shalom to their communities. And in Ethiopian culture, it's very hard as a young person to go and train elders change their way of their philosophy or their way of doing things. And since the evangelical church mainly is a young church, and it's like young in a sense, most of the members are under the age of 35. So I feel like to change that culture at large and help churches go to their communities with a better interventions, it's much better to focus training emerging leaders. To do that, even though we have so many seminaries in Bible college, we don't have a specific center dedicated to train young leaders like youth pastors and youth ministry leaders at all. So I have seen that need, and my denomination leaders also see the need, but to come up with a way to go forward, I'm just wondering what type of research methodologies that I need to use, so that even though the center will be owned by one denomination, most of the trainees that will come from evangelical church and will be working with evangelical church at large. So I'm not sure which type of methodology that I need to pursue.
Would you have access to some emerging leaders that you could actually talk with to understand from their perspective, what do they feel? You might, first of all, understand their mindset in terms of the dichotomy issue that you've just talked about. You might try to design some questions that help a person think about that whole issue about, spiritual versus secular. Can we really find that divide as we look at the scriptures? You would develop some questions. You could possibly just test the mindset of, say, emerging leaders. That might be one place to start. If you have access to some that you could actually talk with, would you have that kind of access at this point?
Yes, sir. I was a coordinator for the youth leadership development department in my head office, and since I have an access to have a chance to talk to many youth leaders all over the country.
I would think that was probably what you'd want to take advantage of, those kinds of relationships. Say you're going to choose, 15, 20 of those people if you can, and you're going to talk with them somehow, and you're going to have a series of discussion questions that you'll talk about, okay? You can, and say maybe they're going to focus on, one aspect of that questioning would be on this whole dichotomy between the spiritual and the secular. Let's just use that terminology because that's been the traditional terminology that's been used often. And then maybe trying to understand the people you talk to, does that seem to be a prominent viewpoint that they have right now based on the fact that they've been raised in the particular Ethiopian culture where they are? And then, trying to understand from a person, where do you think that idea came from? Did you learn that from your elders? Can you actually find that as you read the Bible? You just think, you'd have to just kind of think a little bit in terms of what kinds of discussion questions would help you to have a meaningful conversation with someone on that particular issue. And then from there, my video seems to be breaking up here a little bit. My reception. Anyway, from there, you might want to see if you're asking a person, if you were going to have a training seminar to better equip you for leadership, say in the church or whatever role you're going to be doing in the Christian community, what are some topics that you would like to see discussed in that kind of a training seminar? And then you'd kind of get an idea of some of the themes that some of the people you talk to. But again, you'd be focusing your research, your data gathering on, say, a select group of emerging leaders, 15 or 20 people, and you're going to talk to them about what their mindset is right now, and what kinds of issues they would like to see covered in a seminar approach. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. A great sense.
Okay, good. All right.
Thank you.
We're probably going to run out of time here. Yeah, I've got 10 minutes because I got one more section I've got to cover on the PowerPoint. Probably it's going to be best. We've had a few of you speak. At least hopefully the rest of you getting some kind of a representative feeling of what we're going to what you need to be doing. So let me go ahead and finish out the presentation. Some of these, more of your specific questions, I'm probably going to have to deal with you as I look at your research chapter, and I can give you some ideas as I look at what you're doing there. Let's see. I'm not sure what you're seeing on your screen right now. I've been moving things back and forth there. Are you still seeing the PowerPoint presentation right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Ethical research. Let me just go over a few items here that are fairly important. We have just now started at BGU what we call the BGU Institutional Review Board. BGU has not really had this kind of a formal board in the past, but we are being required because we receive some federal funding through some student loan programs, etc. We are required to have an institutional review board. And that board has the purpose to ensure that ethical practices are taking place in regards to human subject research. And that's kind of language that the United States federal government uses in terms of research. We use the term IRB as the abbreviation for the Institutional Review Board. We've got a policy manual that we've just created, and we will be putting that online so all of you can take a look at that. It's based on U.S. federal policies for research to ensure ethical research principles. Those ethical research really has three foundations that it's based on from the U.S. federal government point of view. First, a respect for persons. They use this kind of language that number one, we need to treat each person as an autonomous agent in terms of, each person has responsibility for him or herself, and we honor that. We respect that individuality. A second concept, though, that's related to the respect for persons is to protect those with diminished autonomy. There may be situations where people, because of they're physically challenged, they're mentally challenged, other situations, they have diminished autonomy. And therefore, we have to do all we can to protect them, okay? Say if you're working with, when I was working at the University of Montana, I had to do some work with, Native Americans with disabilities. Because of those disabilities, they had to receive a certain amount of protection. And we had to see to it that even their privacy was not invaded beyond reasonable limits, as some of these Social Security coordinators got involved in those kinds of cases. So, we needed to make sure that the people that we were working with were respecting the people that they were working with. A second principle is called beneficence, and that means that we are trying to secure the well-being of those who participate in our research, okay? And we do all we can to make sure that they are protected, okay? That we're not taking advantage of them in any way, that we're not, that we're trying to do something that's for their good, for their benefit. That the outcome, the very reason we're doing the kind of research we're doing has to have some benefit to them. At least it may be indirect to start with, but it's in the long run, there needs to be some benefit, okay? And number three, justice, okay? Just ensuring that we're treating everyone equally and fairly. And these are fairly, common concepts that we all work in our daily lives, but they are spelled out in terms of research. So when you submit a final project proposal now to the academic cabinet, you're going to include an IRB form that we've just now, we're working out, and I'll get that form to you so you've got something to submit. and that kind of a form basically, a lot of these issues are in terms of, we call it informed consent. I think we'll talk about that in a moment. That there is a form that you have your research participants fill out, that they're actually consenting to being a part of your research, and that you have spelled out what that research is actually going to entail. Number 4, the IRB form will be reviewed to determine if the IRB needs to review your proposal. Not all proposals are going to have to go to the IRB committee, okay? But some of the two specific areas will need an IRB review at some level. Vulnerable populations, and these are included but not limited to children, prisoners, pregnant women, and handicapped or mentally disabled persons. So if you're dealing with any of those particular populations, if you're going to be talking with any one of those people specifically, you're probably going to have your proposal reviewed by the Institutional Review Board, okay? The other big area that the IRB gets involved in are sensitive topics. And this is if you're collecting information on human subjects that could reasonably cause harm to the participants if that data were not kept strictly confidential. Even when you're, say, trying to understand, I've had situations where they'll do a research and they'll say, does your financial income fall within these particular ranges, Just that kind of information could be used against a person if someone got a hold of it and wanted to use it in a particular way, okay? So the main issue, though, is that in your consent form, the research participant is fully aware of how the information will be used, what kinds of measures will be taken to keep the information confidential, and those are, you'll kind of, when you see the IRB form that you would look at, you'll answer some of those kinds of questions. What kinds of measures will you take to keep information confidential that you collect? So the kinds of issues that sometimes are sometimes obvious, but we need to write them down in writing. And depending on what level of vulnerability or sensitivity of topics that you're working with, will determine the level of review that the IRB will become involved with your proposal. These are a few of the levels that are talked about. An exempt status, the research does not really involve vulnerable populations or sensitive information, and that's fine. The academic cabinet would say, this doesn't seem to fit any of our sensitive or vulnerable criteria, so this proposal is fine. It doesn't really need to go to an IRB. A next level, though, would be an expedited review. Here, the research involves minimal risks with populations that are considered vulnerable or sensitive topics. There could, and so anyway, if there's some hint that it's minimal risk, then we may have an expedited view, which sometimes just 1 or 2 committee members can look at that and say, yeah, here's just a few recommendations you need to make sure that you take into consideration as you proceed with this research. Of course, the final level is called a full review, and here the research does involve vulnerable populations as previously described, and there's sensitive information that will be collected, and it should be saying that there could be some level of risk that could be involved with the the participants in terms of if that information was ever, the confidentiality was ever broken, it could bring that person into risk. Anyway, we're in the process of uploading the IRB policy manual and forms that you'll be able to use with your proposal. And as I look at your research chapter, when you work that out in a couple of weeks, I'll try to give you, at least from my perspective at this point, if I think what you're dealing with will probably need to have some level of institutional review board relationship to you as you're working through that process. Okay, any questions on those ethical research issues? See, this is a fairly new issue that we're really starting to have to focus on. We've always made sure that people use, accurate consent forms, etc. But I think now that we have a formal review process imposed upon us from the U.S. federal government, we need to make sure that we are evaluating all the work that we do as an institution. Galina.
Oh, Dr. Payne, small question. So, do you think I will also need to fill the form since the people I'm going to interview, they don't belong to the United States?
They're in Russia, right? I think.
Yes.
There's a section in the policy manual that actually covers that. I think, if I remember correctly, it actually does say that even if you're doing something in another country as opposed to the United States, since you're doing the research in conjunction with a United States institution, a university, you will need to abide by those standards as much as possible.
Okay.
And so in your case, say if you were going to talk with some people about their family relationships, those could be considered sensitive topics that we'd want to make sure that there's an appropriate consent form that person has signed off on before they actually participate in your research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, at this point, I think we're going to have to close down shop because we're just about out from our hour and a half. And that's what I try to hold these Zoom rooms to. Again, keep working. I think, as I've told you by email, I know some of you are behind on your assignments. And I understand that. Just keep working at it. The main issue is to have that proposal done by mid-March sometime, I think, is when the final assignments need to be submitted for this course. I do ask you, though, to keep up with the discussion boards because all your other classmates, of course, depend on you. This is the last week of discussions, by the way. We just have 7 weeks of discussions, and weeks 8 and 9, you actually won't have discussion boards that you'll need to participate. I want you just to really focus on bringing together that research chapter, which will, just sometimes takes a lot of thinking and concentration. But anyway, make sure, if you have questions that I can answer by email. That's usually how I work best, is to do an email of some type, and I can usually give you, and then if we need to talk more by Skype or a Zoom room, we can do that individually. And I've done that with a few of you already. So with that, I'm going to, I think, close down. There's one other question. Go ahead.
Yes. Again, how many pages are we supposed to write in the next chapter?
The research chapter, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, the research chapter, I imagine it would probably maybe be 5 pages, maybe 4 to 5 pages.
All right. Thank you.
I think something like that. Your outcomes chapter you're working on this week, it may be only a couple pages, 1, 2, maybe 3, but 1 or 2 pages, you might be able to cover the assignment for the outcomes this week. But the research methodology chapter, I'm imagining you're going to probably take 4 or 5 pages. That will be that particular chapter. Okay, all, appreciate you making the effort to join me today, and we will keep working on your chapters, your proposal. Keep submitting those, and I'll keep giving you feedback. I'm behind. I'm going to get back to chapters 4 and 5, weeks 4 and 5, and then 6. We're in dissertation season as we're approaching graduation, so I'm working on a lot of that with other students at this point. But do be assured, I will get your assignments graded and get feedback back to you. But again, the research chapter probably is going to be the one that I'll be giving you the most feedback on, because there's just a lot of issues there that will involve some of these things that we've just talked about. So, All right, with that, I'm going to close down our meeting, and again, just
Thank
thank
you.
and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bain.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.